Continuing, our next speaker is Sian Proctor. This is going to be a fun one. She's a geoscience professor at South Mountain Community College. She's traveled the world teaching kids about science and fun stuff. Her talk is called Meals for Mars, Space Exploration Through Simulations on Earth. Her hiding place as a child was in her closet. Her favorite candy bar, which is not technically a candy bar, but it does still count, are peanut M&Ms, which is fantastic. She prefers a long, soaking bath, much like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. That's her preference, which I totally agree with. She would name her boat Tranquility, and she might have the best answer to the question, or the best question so far. She would want to know how we can time travel. I think it's a pretty good thing. So please welcome to the stage, Sian Proctor.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about my Mars simulation experience. I lived for 4 months in a Mars habitat, and when I come in front of a crowd and instead of presenting, I really like to do is engage in a discussion with the audience. So are you ready to go to Mars with me? So how many of you would actually want to go to, oh, I lost my slides. How many of you would actually want to go to Mars? So, oh, let me go back. So here, are you an A, a B, or a C? So who are my A's? Raise your hand. So you can look around, just a few of you are A's. Who are my B's? Raise your hand if you're B. Okay, how much do you need to get paid? $1 million, $2 million? Who are my C's? You know, it's kind of funny when you think about Mars and what it would take to actually survive on Mars. And so my next question to you is to sit there, talk to the person next to you, and what are the things that we would actually need to do to survive on Mars? So take a moment, talk to the person next to you. What are the things that us as humans would need? Take a moment and talk. Okay, I clicked it. Okay. So, okay, somebody shout out, what does it take to survive on Mars? Everything. Everything. So, potatoes. Radiation protection. Oxygen. Say it again. Communication back to Earth. Okay. Tools. Water. Weapons just in case. So there are a lot of things that we would want to be able to survive on Mars. I heard somebody said potatoes. Matt Damon. Oh, I think we just skipped. Let me get back to. Sorry. Right? So let me get one more. And so that whole idea of Matt Damon would be great, right? His character from The Martian. But the big four that we often think about are air, water, food, and shelter. The things that we need to survive here on Earth. One of the things that we don't think about a lot of times is the psychological aspects. Someone had mentioned, I think, like crew cohesion, or what does it take to have a good group of people who can survive and thrive on Mars from a psychological standpoint. And so what's interesting is that over the last few decades, there have been Mars simulations popping up all around the world. And so one of the ones that I am in, I think this clicker actually may be, so these Mars simulations are popping up all around the world. And what they're really looking at is the psychology behind going to Mars. What does it mean to take a group of people and stick them in isolation and have them act like they're really on Mars? Will you see any kind of breakdowns over the 4-month simulation or the 6 months or a year, maybe even longer than a year? If you go into Mars, the average trip to Mars is going to be 3 years round trip. So you're looking at, depending on the spatial relationship of where the Earth is and Mars is, you're looking at maybe like 9 months to get there, then you hang out on the surface for a year, and then coming back. And so they're setting up all of these analogs around the world to study who would be a good crew. The one that I got into is called High Seas. It's called High Seas. It was started in Hawaii. 2 research investigators, one from the University of Hawaii and the other one from Cornell University, got together and they submitted a proposal to NASA. They said, look, Hawaii is a great location for a Mars analog. And I'll get into the geology of why that is in a moment. And so they put in their proposal and it got accepted. And so the next thing that they needed were people to volunteer to go and live in the Mars simulation for 4 months. And so a lot of times people ask me, how did you end up living in a Mars simulation? And the funny thing about that is Mars wasn't even on my radar. I've always been kind of a space girl. I like space exploration. I applied for the NASA astronaut program in 2009 and I was a finalist for it. But I never really thought about Mars, and I didn't even realize that they had these analog sites located, in all these various places. And so Facebook, a friend of mine who actually lives in Los Angeles, one day posted on Facebook, you like food and you like space, you should apply for this project. And it was to go and live in the Mars simulation. And I was like, I do like food and I do like space. I'm going to apply. And so I applied and I got accepted to go, along with 6 other individuals, thank you, to live in the high seas habitat. Now this is, as you can see, it's a geodesic dome. It's on the big island of Hawaii. It's on the slopes of Mauna Loa, about 8,000 feet above sea level. In the background you can see Mauna Kea. And the usable space is about just under 900 square feet of usable space. And we were specifically brought into the simulation to study the effects of food strategies for long-duration space flight. Food strategies. Now, the reason why we were looking at food is because when astronauts go into space right now, they suffer from food apathy. When you go up into space and you don't have gravity pulling all of the fluids down, your body physically changes. You get puffier, your fluids are different. So when you eat food, the food actually tastes different. And as a result, astronauts don't tend to eat as much as they should. NASA has a lot of trouble with having the astronauts keep weight. And another thing about the way they eat in space is a lot of the meals are already pre-prepared. So you just add water and heat. And so if you like to cook, this is one of those things where, well, you're not going to be doing any cooking up on the ISS. And so NASA was thinking, okay, if we go to Mars, Mars has roughly 1/3 the gravity of Earth. And so what would be the bang for the buck if we allow astronauts to cook? What if we could give them ingredients, shelf-stable ingredients that we sent to Mars, and then they could prepare meals? Think about what we get from cooking. Think about the process of joining food together and the sitting around and enjoying a meal. And what does that mean as far as being human and the psychological aspects of food? And so I was like, yeah, okay, I can go and live in this Mars simulation for 4 months and and to cook food, right? How much fun would that be? So how many of you would go into the Mars simulation if you could for 4 months? Raise your hand. Okay, we can see, wow, there's a lot more of you that would go to in a Mars simulation than would go to Mars. And so one of the things that about the High Seas HAB is the living situation. So in 2013, when we came to do the simulation, we were the very first crew selected. And this is what the HAB looked like. It's a geodesic dome. We had an upstairs and we had a downstairs. The upstairs consisted of 6 bedrooms. So we each had our own individual bedroom. Mine was actually this one right here. And so really small space, but it had a door. So this was really our only private area. And just long enough to sleep along the back. If you were really tall, you might not be able to fit quite in your bed, but a little single bed. And this is the upstairs right here. And then downstairs, oh, and upstairs, right in this area, we had a half bathroom upstairs. And then downstairs, we had a kitchen. And the kitchen was really important because this was a food study. The other area that was really important was the dining room table, which sits right over here. We had a bathroom and a shower down on the first level, and that's located right here. So this is the kitchen, the dining room where we're sitting. This is common space for us. We had a bathroom with a shower. Now we were limited on how much we could shower. We could shower once a week to twice a week for 1 minute to 2 minutes. So if you like to shower, I like soaking baths. So that wasn't happening on Mars. And then we had a lab area right here to do some laboratory experiments while we were in the HAB. One of the important ideas is the crew. Who would you want to go to Mars with you, right? Matt Damon, of course, well, his character from The Martian. And so for the simulation, we didn't get to choose who was in the simulation with us for the most part. What happened was the 2 principal investigators, one from the University of Hawaii and the other one from Cornell, sent out a call for people internationally to live in the Mars simulation. They got, I think, around 700 applications, and they were looking for 6 individuals. And the 6 individuals they ended up choosing was a really nice international crew. We had our commander, Angelo, he's Belgian. We had me as the education outreach officer. And what was interesting about applying to be in the Mars simulation, you had a couple of criteria that you had to meet. One, you had to meet the NASA standard for becoming an astronaut, which is a degree in science. So all of our crew members have science degrees. And you had to put in a proposal for what you wanted to do while in the simulation. So you had, as some kind of science experiment that you had to put down that you wanted to do while you were there. Because they realized you're going to be there for 4 months. You had to have some kind of, I guess you'd say, skin in the game. You had to have some reason to be there. What kind of research would you want to do or contribute? Now, I'm a community college professor in Phoenix. I teach geology, but I do a lot of education outreach. And when I went to apply to be in the High Seas program, if you had seen the website, you would have been like, this is a scam, this is crazy. They had neon colors, it was weird, it was all like, it was really bad. So when I put in my application, I said, you need an education outreach officer. And I was like, this is what I can do for you. First, I will clean up your website. Make it look like, a normal person would use it. And then I said, I will create educational videos for you and I'll document what's happening in the HAB as we go through these 4 months. And so that's what I came in. And that's why I'm labeled as Education Outreach Officer. Jahaira is from Puerto Rico, and she was getting her PhD at Cornell University. I think she had just graduated, and she was our crew scientist. And then we have Oleg. Oleg was the crew geologist, and he, at the time, was a USGS geologist, and he grew up in Russia until he was 12, and then moved to the United States. And so it was really interesting to have him and his cultural background in the habitat. And then we have Kate. Kate was a crew writer. Not something that you would think about when you're going on a Mars simulation, right? To have a crew writer. But Kate has a degree, her master's is in physics, and then she turned into a science writer. So she came in with contracts to Discover Magazine, to The Economist. She had all these kind of writing connections that she could leverage while in the habitat. And now this was important because, again, we're the first mission. So how do you get the word out that we're doing this kind of research? NASA wants people to know that these kinds of things are happening. And then you have Simon. Simon's Canadian, and he was our crew engineer. And so a lot of times you can think of it, he was our Matt Damon to some extent. So it was his job to make sure that the habitat functioned every day. And keep in mind, we're the first crew to go in. So nothing is set up. And so we were the ones who had to make sure to test all the systems. And unfortunately, a lot of systems kind of broke down while we were on Mars. And it was our job to figure out how to solve those issues. So thinking about who you would want in your crew. Is there anything up here we're missing that you would want?
Medical.
Medical, that's a big one, right? We don't have a doctor here. Now, if I'm going to Mars, I would really like to have a doctor with me. Oleg acted as our medical officer because, and the reason why, he had the most outdoor wilderness experience of the group. And so if anything went wrong, you know, he was the one who's going to help us. But keep in mind, we were 20 minutes basically from the nearest help. And so if something seriously went wrong, we had access to people who could help us. And that's one of the things that's interesting about a Mars simulation on Earth, is that you're on Earth. And so those resources that are lacking in the hab here that you might want, like a medical doctor, well, that's okay, because you got that access. Oh. Wow. I think is that the next slide? And so one of the interesting things about living in a Mars simulation, people are like, well, did you have to stay inside the whole time? Could you go outside? And I'm like, yes, we could go outside, but we had to wear a spacesuit. And it was really interesting to actually go outside. And the reason why Hawaii is an excellent spot for these Mars analogs is because of the terrain. If you look here, you'll notice that it's very rocky. And there is no, even if we go back one, let's see if we go back one. Sorry, I want to go to that slide. Oh. I don't know if it's me or, so this doesn't work, the clicker doesn't? Okay, let me try it with the clicker. All right. Whoa. This is some of the things that happens on Mars. Is that maybe I'll just start right here at that. Okay. And so going outside, but you had to go outside in a spacesuit. And that was one of the really interesting things about being in the simulation. Going back to the reason why Hawaii is an excellent analog for Mars is that the terrain is very young. It's volcanic. It's basaltic, very much like Mars. There's not a lot of trees or vegetation, so it's barren. And there are lava tubes. How many of you know what lava tubes are? Lava tubes are really cool. So when you have this basaltic lava that flows, the top of it will crust over, but the hot middle lava that's flowing will flow out and it will empty the chamber and it will leave this tube behind. And then what will happen is the top of that crusted over rock will sometimes cave in, creating skylights. And so these lava tubes are one of the places where, if we go to Mars, we might actually live. The reason why is because that rock can help protect from the radiation that you would get, the radiation exposure on Mars. And so here is a great picture that shows what the terrain looks like, and you can just see that there's no trees or anything. You can see how rocky it is. And so that's one of the reasons why they said, hey, let's put this analog site on the Big Island of Hawaii. A lot of people are like, oh, you're going to Hawaii. I'm like, yeah, but I'm living at 8,000 feet up. It's not as great as you think. And so, so when we're talking about being on Mars, 3, one more. I need one more. There, okay. One of the big things that these Mars analog research sites looks at is boredom. Would you get bored on Mars? If you think about that, I mean, sure, you could go outside, it'd be new and exciting, but after the first month or two, it's rock, it's barren. Think about all of the stimulation that you have now on Earth that you wouldn't have on Mars. And so in these Mars simulations, they do a lot looking at how do we entertain ourselves when we're stuck in a habitat that's only 900 square feet with 5 other individuals. And so for us, some of the things that we did was we had movie night every Friday, and a different crew member got to pick what movie we actually watched, which is interesting when you have an international crew. We had to exercise every day as part of our research. We also played games. We ate all of our meals together because it's a meal study. We had a lot of paperwork and things, tests that we had to do as a result of the food study that we were doing. Some of the other things that we had were robotic pets. Yeah, right? You can't bring Fluffy with you to Mars. So what are you going to do if you like pets? One of the things that you can do while NASA's looking at is robotic pets. Can we get to the point where we can have a robotic pet that goes along with us to Mars? And what would that mean psychologically for the crew to have that? So Simon brought in these robotic pets that we actually interacted with. This is one of them here, and then this is the other one here, to see whether or not that changed our mood to be able to interact with these robotic pets. And so getting bored on Mars is a real concern. And now I talked about going outside already on EVAs. Extravehicular activity is what we call just leaving the hab. So when we were in the Mars simulation, we were allowed to leave the habitat, but we had to wear a spacesuit. So that means that anytime that you left the habitat, somebody had to put the spacesuit on you and help you get into it, and then you were able to go into what we call the airlock. And we sat in the airlock for 5 minutes, and basically that would be the transition between the Martian atmosphere and our interior atmosphere. And then once that was set, then we could go out and we could explore the terrain around the habitat. And we ended up going on 50 EVAs. And what's interesting is that Simon went out of the habitat the most, and I went out the second most. And the reason why, well, first let's talk about the geology a little bit. And so the geology on Mars was really great because the Big Island of Hawaii, we had Oleg as our USGS geologist, and we went and we collected samples. But this gives you an idea of the spacesuits that we wore while we were in the habitat. We were actually testing different types of spacesuits from different universities. So we had hazmat suits that were converted into spacesuits. And then we had ones that looked more like an astronaut would have today. And what was interesting is that, how hot do you get in these spacesuits? And so the ones that were the hazmat suits, when you're in it, what was interesting is that we would fog up our mask. And so I would wear a headband, and I would put my head, because you can't touch your face, and I'd have to lean forward and wipe off the head, and then be able to walk You know, and so you can see in some of the pictures we have poles because, how many of you been to Hawaii? Has anybody been to Hawaii here? Do you remember what it was like, the terrain, how rocky and rough it is? And so walking over that terrain with no trails and making sure that you don't trip and fall and get hurt. And so you can see in some of these pictures what the terrain was like, and like no trails to walk on. And then the skylights and the lava tubes. So going in and investigating what it was like to enter the lava tubes with a spacesuit, and then to do investigations on what's happening in those lava tubes, collecting some of the rocks and samples and taking a look at them. And so going out of the habitat was a real treat. We had to ask our mission control for permission to leave the habitat. And like I was saying, Simon had to go out every day and do a check around the hab, and then I went out the second most. And the reason why I went out the second most is because Kate had a contract with Discover magazine to write an article that was going to be printed in Discover magazine. She knew this before she came into the high seas habitat. So one day she reaches out to me and says, Sian, you're going to be the education outreach officer. I need a photographer for Discover magazine. And I was like, Kate, I'm an amateur photographer. I'm not a professional. She's like, don't worry, just be my photographer. Talk to Discover magazine. And so I did, and I ended up being on contract with Discover magazine during the high seas mission, shooting pictures of Kate to be published in Discover magazine. And one of the cool things was, because we knew it was going to be print, the person that's the editor said, look, if you get a good shot of the high seas habitat, then we'll maybe put it on the cover. Right? And I'm an amateur, so I'm like, okay, astrophotography. I've never done astrophotography in my life. So it was my mission to get an amazing shot of the high seas habitat. This was the very first picture I took of the hab before the night that we went in. And then this was my best shot that I got. It took me every single, not every night I could go out, but I got this shot the very last night before we left the habitat. Because I would go out at night and I was in a spacesuit. And I have my tripod and I have my camera, and then if any of you have done night photography and I'm setting it up in the dark, I mean, you can't put a headlamp over your head because you got a spacesuit on, right? So you're kind of like fumbling and you're trying to like try different settings. And so it was a real chore to try and get that picture. And I finally got it. And then a year passes after we get out of the hab, and then finally Discover magazine says, we're not going to do a print article, we're going to do a digital article. And so all of my pictures ended up digitally online in Kate's article there. But the experience that I got to do was amazing. Let me go on. Manually? Yeah. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So one of the cool things, I'll keep this so I can point things out. One of the cool things is that, again, we came in, the main study of research was food preparation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we also had all this other research that came in from NASA and the crew itself. For instance, Kate had a sleeping research project that she had us do. So we wore little headbands to monitor our sleep every night. And then in the morning, we would have a blue light that flashed on us for 20 minutes to see whether or not that affected our sleeping. Jahira was looking at textiles and microbial growth. We had to do sniff and scratch and sniff tests as part of the food research that we were doing. And then there was also exercise. NASA gave us all of these t-shirts that we had to wear that were specially built to fight microbes. You ever wonder why in like Star Wars or Star Trek they're always wearing the same outfit? It's because you can't carry a lot with you in space. And so if we were actually going to go to Mars, think about how many outfits they would allow you to have. Not many, because there's not a lot of space. And so NASA's really interested in how do we fight microbial growth so that you can wear the same clothes again and again. And so we had these t-shirts, and what they wanted us to do was to put the t-shirt on. There were 7 of them, and we would work out every day for an hour until we were sweating enough so that the t-shirt would get wet. And then we would hang the t-shirt up, and the next day we would take the t-shirt, smell it, rate it, and decide if we would want to wear it again. Now, I will tell you that I blew through all 7 of my t-shirts like I was the first one. I was like, yep, no, no, no. Mainly because they had a little bit of a chemical smell, and my father passed away from lung cancer, so I was like, I don't want to smell that. But I will tell you that there were 2 crew members in the HAB that took out t-shirt number 1 and wore it every day, 120 days, worked out on it, and never switched to the second t-shirt. Yeah. And people were like, did it smell bad? I didn't notice, but I thought it was interesting. And one of them was a female and one of them was a male that wore just 1 t-shirt the entire time. Okay. Now, next slide. So this, I wanted to give you an idea of what it was like science-wise in the habitat, and as the Education Outreach Officer, I created this little video. So we're going to watch this video for a second. They're just going to transition over to it.
Was that the other one?
Yep. Right now, I am living smack dab in the middle of a science experiment. It's called High Seas, and it's a simulated mission to Mars where we're testing out all kinds of scientific questions. How cool is that? Simon, you're the High Seas engineer. I noticed that you are working on some modeling, wearing 3D glasses. What exactly are you doing?
We have a 3D printer coming to the habitat, and we're going to use it to print out parts that we might need. And I'm just practicing building these parts right now.
That's really cool. Can I see what it looks like?
Sure.
Whoa! Wicked. That's cool. So can you build me a car?
I'm not sure.
Jahaira, you are the High Seas Science Officer. You brought in all these textiles for us to wear. What exactly are you looking for?
I am looking for the organisms that live on our clothes.
So you're saying that there are creatures living on our clothing?
Yes, there are millions of bacteria growing on your clothes, including your socks.
Wow, that's a lot. Is there anything we can do about it?
Yes, we can do something about it. For example, these socks contain copper particles that will kill some of those organisms so that your feet don't get stinky.
So you're saying that if I wear these socks, my feet won't smell anymore?
They won't smell anymore.
I am totally going to change right now.
Yeah, give it a try.
Hey Oleg, I have seen you around the habitat with this camera. What exactly are you doing?
Well, I'm taking thermal images.
What exactly does that mean?
Well, that basically measures the amount of heat emitted by objects.
That's really cool. So you're saying that if I got in front of this camera, you'd make me look hot?
Well, we can give it a try.
98.6 degrees worth of hotness.
Or 37 Celsius to be exact.
Excellent. I'm having a blast, but you don't have to go to another planet to live in a world full of science, technology, engineering, and math. It's everywhere. I'm Dr. Proctor, and I've made a career out of science, technology, engineering, and math. Thank you for taking a look at my STEM world. Now let's go explore yours. So one of the fun challenges was getting people interested in the high seas research and what we were doing in the habitat, and especially kids, you know, to get them excited about this. And so the next thing to talk about is the research study for food. Now, how many of you are foodies? Like food? All right. And so one of the things that was interesting about this research study is that NASA wanted to know what it would be like if you had a crew of 6 people who cooked like astronauts do today, which means just already prepared meals that you just add water and you heat, versus giving them a pantry with shelf-stable ingredients in it and saying, hey, cook whatever you want. And so that was the main crux of the research the research project. So on this slide, could you eat anything think about that question. Could you eat anything? How many of you are A's? So how many of you watch Survivor when they have to eat some weird stuff? So could you eat anything? You can see the people. We're like, yeah, I could do it. You're like, yeah, not a problem. How many of you are B? Right? Yes, I think I would have to be the B person. And how many of you are C? And so this whole idea of like, I found that there was a direct correlation between what you will eat and how hungry you are. So like if you start to starve, the more that list of what you will eat changes. I learned that I did a post-apocalyptic TV show called The Colony on the Discovery Channel, and that was a whole nother talk, But I learned what I could eat and not eat on that show. And so I'm definitely a B. And when you're thinking about Mars and your food selection, there's not necessarily going to be a lot of variety. And so thinking about what foods you might miss. Next slide, please. And so for the food study, what was interesting is the creativity that came from having an international crew and a pantry of shelf-stable ingredients. I was amazed at some of the things people figured out. Oleg figured out how to make ice cream right here. Just really interesting combinations came out. And so coming together at the table and eating was every day when we were creatively cooking was unique, because what we came up with was a system where every crew member cooked with another crew member, and it rotated over the 120 days. And so 2 of those days you had to eat like NASA astronauts eat now. Just add water and heat. And the other 2 days you got to creatively cook. And it rotated for the 120 days. 2 as astronauts eat now, 2 creative cooking. Then 2 as astronauts eat now, 2 creative cooking. And then we had to come up with the schedule of who's gonna cook throughout the 120 days. Now, when I said who was foodies and who liked to eat, you notice that not everybody likes to eat, but not everybody likes to cook. And so you think about going to Mars and the psychology around food and cooking, but what if every member in the crew don't care, right? Simon, our engineer, we always knew what we were going to get when Simon was cooking. It was pasta. He just boiled water, put pasta in, stirred it, added sauce. That was our meal, because he really wasn't into cooking. And so when we're thinking about the psychology that food has and being able to creatively cook, is it worth the resources needed to be able to do that? Next slide. And so as the education outreach officer, it was my job to get people excited about going to Mars on this mission in Hawaii. So before we even went to Mars in Hawaii, I sent out an email, a shout out. Well, actually, it was on the High Seas website, but basically I ran a recipe contest. And so I sent out this international call for recipes. And I said, hey, here's our shelf-stable ingredients, submit your recipe here. And over 70 people submitted recipes for us. And what I said is, look, if we choose your recipe, what I'll do is I'll cook it in the habitat with my crewmates and share your recipe. So what happened, I came up with Meals for Mars, and these are just pictures of the different categories. We had snacks and desserts, we had breakfast, we had soups and stews, we had main meals, and we had side dishes. And I ran a cooking show called Meals for Mars while in the habitat. And so every week I would cook with a different crewmate, and we would go through and we would take one of these recipes and we would make it, and then we would rate how well the recipe was. And then in the end we came up with some of the top meals. like Moroccan beef tagine, or this was called dark matter cake with stardust frosting. People came up with amazing recipes for us to make. And so one of the things that's interesting is like, what food would you miss in space? If you were going to have to go into space, what food would you want to have with you? What would you miss? And you take a moment and talk to each other in your groups. What food would you miss? I think that's number one. Okay, so thinking about what food we would miss, what were some of the things that you'd miss? Fresh guacamole. Fresh produce, somebody said. Anything else? Bacon. Well, we actually had bacon. Surprisingly, I guess, I don't know how self-stable it was, but it came pre-packaged, didn't have to be refrigerated, and that we could microwave. And so, I know, right? And so we had freeze-dried and dehydrated vegetables and fruits and meat. So we had chicken and we had beef, but it wasn't like the beef that we normally get that's nice and fresh and that we cooked. It had been dehydrated or freeze-dried, so we had to add water back into it to make it, usable. I will put usable. But, and the thing about the vegetables, somebody said fresh produce, the vegetables were always a little bit soggy because they were dehydrated and you rehydrated them, so they didn't have that crunch, right? The texture just wasn't the same as what you would normally have. But we were able to do all of these really cool recipes by just doing a shout out and saying, hey, submit a recipe to Meals from Mars and I'll run this cooking show. And so I actually put together a whole set, next slide please, of shows. Spam was
Hello,
popular.
and welcome back to Meals for Mars. I'm with Jahira, of course. Can't seem to get away from each other when it comes to cooking. And so today we've got Cajun-style Spam Jambalaya by James Harris. So the Spam is back. You'll notice that the wok is out, and we're going to get sizzling in the hab. You ready to make some jambalaya?
Sure. Let's turn off the wok.
Yeah, let's get this wok going so that we can sizzle. Sizzling our Spam, and then you're going to add in our ingredients. Besides our Spam, what do we have as ingredients, Jahira?
We have some celery here, bell peppers, brown rice, some dried tomatoes, and a mixture of onions and garlic that have been rehydrated.
Absolutely, and then we have a paste that I made the day before that is hot sauce, garlic, and wait, it's garlic and what else? Chili pepper, Primero chili pepper. Oh, we're already sizzling. Wow, you ready to get this? Oh, look at you backing up. You've seen the videos, huh? We're too hot already? Yeah, it's all right. Not an issue. It's just getting started. She's getting all protected. She's going to use it like a shield.
So that just gives you an idea. That's perfect. You can stop it right there. That just gives you an idea of some of the ingredients we had while we were in the hab. So we had an extensive spice collection. We had all of these different dehydrated and freeze-dried vegetables and meats and stuff, so people could be really creative. And then doing the Meals from Mars series was a great way to have people follow the mission. So on that, we had a High Seas YouTube channel that I was able to push up those videos so that people could follow along. And so one of the things that is interesting is that the High Seas mission was originally funded as a food study. But the really interesting thing that the main PI out of Hawaii wanted to know was about crew cohesion. how well can you get along with the people that are going to go to Mars? And so in our 4 months, it was interesting to see the dynamics play out between the crew members. We actually got along really well, and we're all friends. But it was really interesting to see, first of all, we had the dinner table, where people sat at the dinner table. Once people found their spot, that was their spot. And what was interesting is that the 3 people on one end were the more extroverts, and 3 people on the other end were the introverts. And the people who had the most conflict were the 2 people at the head of the table. Had the most conflict within. And it was interesting because it just turned out that one of them was our commander, Angelo. He was at one end of the table. And then Simon, our crew engineer, was on the other end of the table. And so they got along, but there was definitely some times when you had tension. And so what NASA has really learned is that conflict is going to happen in these missions. The really interesting thing is how we deal with the conflict. So conflict resolution. And so can we train future crews that are going to go on these long duration space flights how to basically play well in the sandbox, and when things get ugly in the sandbox, how do you resolve that? And then be able to move forward and not hold grudges and do weird things to each other. And so in the High Seas Hab, luckily, for the most part, we all got along, but there were a few times when, hey, we should do it this way. No, I think we should do it this way. And so those kinds of situations arise. And especially since we were the first crew to go in there were a lot of things that were kind of breaking down and not working correctly. And so the commander, Simon, let's fix this. And Simon's like, I'm trying, And so there's some conflict that kind of arises from those kinds of things. And so the High Seas crew, or I should say the High Seas mission is still continuing. This next slide will show. So we were mission number 1, and that was our crew. And then there was mission number 2. They bumped it up to 8 months. Then, 4 months again, mission number 2. Then mission number 3 was 8 months. Mission number 4 was a year. And so they've got a new crew going in right now, actually, into the High Seas Hab. And so anybody want to volunteer, talk to me afterwards. I'll give you that website. And you can see the makeup of each of the crew here. It's been 3 men and 3 women. The last crew, I don't have their picture up, but they actually have done High Seas mission number 5, and it was another, I believe, 8-month mission. And in that mission, they had 4 males and 2 females, I believe. And now they're going into High Seas mission number 6. And so how many of you guys could do 4 months in the High Seas habitat? How many of you can do 8 months? Anybody want to do a year? No? Nobody? What's the sign? I'm the same way. I'm like, yeah. And so what was interesting about coming out of the High Seas Mars mission is that a reporter contacted me afterwards, and she was like, okay, are you ready to go to Mars? And I was like, no. What I realized about myself is that I love space exploration, but I grew up in the era of the space shuttle and the Apollo missions and things like that. And so I'm a moon girl. I'm like, send me to the moon for 2 weeks. I'll hit some golf balls, drive a dune buggy around. Then I'm going back to Earth and hanging out. And so I like the idea of us going to Mars, but I absolutely love the idea of us going back to the moon. Man has stepped on the moon, but woman, who is going to be the first female to step on the moon? And so those are the things that I really want to see happen. I would love to see us go to Mars in my lifetime, but I'd love to see us colonize the moon in my lifetime first. And so the last slide. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, talking about exploring Mars.
Sian Proctor, thank you so much. Fantastic. Fantastic. Such earnest enthusiasm. It's really wonderful. It's lunchtime. For those of you that signed up for lunch, it's a little bit delayed, so they will be opening the doors in just a little while. But we'll be back here at... Oh, yeah.
I'll be available if people have questions, so I don't know if...
Were you an A or a B?
For
going into the HAB. You asked if we would go to Mars, sure, or how much?
Yeah.
What was it for you?
For going in the HAB, I was absolutely, I'll do pretty much any simulation on Earth for the most part. But if going actually on a Mars mission, like Mars 1, one-way mission? Did you guys hear about Mars 1? Like, if you were going on a one-way mission to Mars, what stops you from killing all of your other people so that you could be king of Mars, right? Because do we know who, do we know who the second, we do know who, a lot of you guys know who the second person to step on the moon was, but who was the third? Who was the fourth? Who was the fifth? Everybody knows who's number one. And then you're on a mission to Mars, and it's taking you 9 months to get there, and you're like, who's going to be the first one? Well, if I kill them all, I will be the first one, right? So the psychology of that, I feel, is a little flawed. But yes, I would go and do another simulation here. I don't know if I would do a full year because, that question of boredom. I didn't get bored because I was doing the recipe contest and all of that. But the novelty does wear off. After you've been in the HAB for a month, you're cooking every day, you're playing with robotic pets, you're going outside every once in a while. It's the same thing pretty much every day. So that you don't get the same variety that we get now when we're not in those kinds of things.
Well, we'll do a few questions. If you have to go to lunch, we'll do some. Sheldon has one.
I know you guys were in a relatively isolated place, but please tell me there was at least a chance that someone spotted you guys out there in spacesuits, stumbling around, because the conspiracy theories alone on the internet are going to be magnificent.
We were really worried about, what you'd call people, looky-loos, coming to, look in the window. But surprisingly, it's really kind of up on an isolated dirt road, and we did not get a lot of people coming up. I think now that people know more about it, because we were the first mission, so there wasn't a lot of press out there. But now I can see people who go to the Big Island, they'll be like, let's go find that HAB, right? There's a crew in there. There's nothing to really stop people from doing that now.
So it appears you're not taking into account, you're ignoring the factor of gravity, of a different gravitational environment. You can't do cooking or even 3D printing, it seems to me, in a different gravity. So where does that come in?
And so those were the things, and that's one of the reasons why we weren't in a sealed habitat, because we didn't need to for what they were trying to study. And so it was more about crew cohesion and whether or not food, being able to interact with each other cooking, was something that NASA wanted to know about. But a lot of it is about crew cohesion, so we don't worry about those constraints.
On the slide that had the photos of the completed recipes, there were two things that were just boggling my mind. One looked like a green puddle.
Martian skin.
What is that?
That was what they called it, Martian skin. And so that's Jell-O that you basically, you make Jell-O with water, but then you boil it down so that it becomes sticky, and then you just put it on a greased cookie sheet and and then let it settle, and then when you peel it apart, it's like Martian skin.
All right? And then same question about just to the right of the text. It kind of looks like a bread bowl, but...
Yeah, that was actually a cake. And what's interesting about it is that this cake was actually, sometimes you get random people that you run into. So I was at NSF, and one of the people at NSF's knew the White House pastry chef, and he sent me a recipe. And this was it, but we kind of messed it up a little bit. And so the frosting glaze kind of sat, but it's actually a cake that was made. And it was a recipe from the White House.
Let's do one more here.
So what was your conclusion? Was it worth the extra resources to have all the cooking, or go back to the way astronauts normally do it?
I think that it needs to be a combination of both. I think that, depending on, I think once we get really settled then the whole idea of cooking and being creative. Because you got to imagine that whether we build a moon base or go to Mars, you're going to send the supplies over. And so as you're sending those supplies, I think in the beginning, it would be a lot more like astronauts eat now, where you're just heating up and eating, adding water that way. But then over time, I would definitely see that they would want to add in some creative cooking.
So fascinating. One more time, a round of applause for Sian Proctor. Thank you so much.